911. Yes, I'd like to report an explosion.
Okay.
Top of Alabama Hill.
911.
Yeah, I'm sure you've already received a recall about a huge fire on Alabama Hill.
Okay.
911.
Yeah, I'm on Iowa Street and I just saw like a very big explosion.
Do you know what exploded?
911.
We're just downstream from Whatcom Falls Park, which is one of the kind of key parks within the central part of Bellingham. Sits right in the middle of Bellingham. It's been there a long time. Everybody knows where it is. It has some historic waterfalls in it that have some old bridges built by the conservation crews back in the 1930s. Back in 1999, it was a sunny June day and people were fishing in this creek. The creek has both trout and salmon in it certain times of the year. Lots of people just recreating on the trails throughout Whatcom Falls Park. And it's a busy industrial area just off to the north of here a little bit, so lots of people coming and going along the creek. Well, in the afternoon of June 10th, 1999, what happened here was that a pipeline that's just upstream from us that crosses the creek that really everybody had kind of forgotten about burst that day right near the creek and dumped 250,000 gallons of unleaded gas into this creek right here. We have some refineries here in Whatcom County out on Cherry Point, and the pipeline starts out there at those refineries moving liquid fuels from those refineries down towards Seattle, moves a lot of jet fuel down to the airport, the SeaTac airport, and then on all the way down to Portland. It moves both jet fuel and unleaded gas, gasoline types of fuels all the way down there. The pipeline's over 50 years old, so it's been here for a long time. That's why I think a lot of people had forgotten that we even had a pipeline in our community. The pipeline had ruptured and had been dumping fuel out of the pipeline and into the creek for nearly an hour. The gas flowed down, kind of floating on the surface of the creek for 2 miles before it actually found an ignition source. And then this whole creek in part of the park blew up. Killed every living thing in the creek all the way down to the ocean, burned down some houses, and killed 3 children that were in a park at the time. 2 10-year-old boys who were playing together and an 18-year-old teenager who had just graduated from high school just a week or so before. He was actually fishing in the creek, and as the fuel came down the creek, the fumes, he was trapped in a canyon up in the park. The fumes from the fuel actually overwhelmed him and he fell in the creek, and he drowned actually before the fuel found an ignition source. I, at that time, was running the largest retail business in Bellingham, which sits right on the banks of Whatcom Creek a little farther down. And I was in the store that day. It was a store selling used building materials, and customers came running in and said, Bellingham just blew up. And we went out the door of the store and we looked up towards Bellingham, and you could see this huge cloud looming up over Bellingham. And it was like, what could that possibly be? No one had a clue what could have happened. We went in and turned the radio on, and it took quite a long time for anybody from the radio or for the emergency response to really identify what the problem was and what had occurred. But at one point they said there's fuel coming down Whatcom Creek, and we were standing like right next to Whatcom Creek down a ways. So we shut the store down and evacuated everybody out of that area, and then left town because no one knew what was in that ominous cloud that was rising up over the city too. It looked like something you probably shouldn't be breathing. The history of the pipeline, it hadn't had a lot of failures before, but it had had multiple problems in the months before this incident occurred. They had installed some new valves south of town here, and they'd have that valve kept shutting by itself over and over again in the months before this occurred. Some work had been done up here at the Bellingham water treatment plant where they'd been excavating near the pipeline, and at some point in the past, someone had dinged the pipeline with a backhoe and caused a weakness in the pipeline. So on the day this failure occurred, the valve shut off by itself without anybody telling it to 10 miles south of town, which caused the pipe to slam shut, and so the fuel bounced back towards Bellingham. And as that wave of fuel ran back up that 16-inch pipeline, when it hit this weakness caused by the excavator years before, it caused the pipeline to rupture at that point and fuel flowed into the creek. It took weeks just to kind of get the major hazards out of the creek. Took a long time to get the trapped fuel out of the creek. They actually went up and down this creek for 2 miles with backhoes and turned every rock and cleaned every rock. So it was a huge response. It was shared by the federal government who oversaw the natural resource damages, but the city of Bellingham played a huge part in the restoration of the creek. And there was a lot of money that came in. To some degree, the creek is probably better off now than it even was before the explosion, just because there was such an effort to restore this creek and make it habitable to salmon again, and salmon still come up here in the fall. It used to be kind of a straight arrow creek, and as you can see along here, they've put some meanders into the creek. They've done a lot of habitat work. So it was a pretty amazing restoration, and all of this vegetation along where we're standing now, other than the big trees, is all new since 1999. You know, after the community responded and we formed this little Safe Bellingham group, the parents who had lost the 3 children here in town really went to bat for the idea of an ongoing long-term watchdog group. The U.S. Justice Department was kind of aghast, not only at the way the pipeline company had not maintained this pipeline well, but also how the federal regulators hadn't done much to regulate it very well either. So the families went to bat for the idea of a long-term watchdog group to keep an eye on both the pipeline industry and the regulators. And the U.S. Justice Department agreed with them that that was a very valuable thing and needed to be done. So as they went through the prosecution of this case, they helped set aside $4 million of the settlement of that case to create the Pipeline Safety Trust here in Bellingham to keep an eye on both the industry and the regulators nationwide. It still is really the only national nonprofit group that focuses on pipeline safety anywhere in the country. So we filled a void, and we've worked a lot with the regulators, both state and federal regulators, the industry themselves, and then communities throughout the country that have either questions or have been affected by a pipeline incident or proposed pipelines all over the country. We always have a laundry list of where the weaknesses are in pipeline safety, and we don't even do much work here in Washington State anymore, because Washington State was a great example after our tragedy here of a state that stepped up and took on more authority. So we have state inspectors now that are helping the federal inspectors, so we have 2 layers of inspectors. So we've turned our sights to other parts of the country where things are not as strong, in regulations that are not as strong. Pennsylvania, for example, put 10,000 new miles of pipelines into the state of Pennsylvania last year. 9,200 of those miles are completely and totally unregulated. There's no regulations about how they go in the ground, how they're maintained, or how they're operated, because they slipped through a loophole in the federal pipeline safety regulations. That's really high on our list right now to get those pipelines regulated. This event, when it occurred, really changed the way people moved on pipeline regulations. Congress started holding hearings fairly shortly in the fall after this event, and they moved forward fairly rapidly on regulations. For instance, up until the time this pipeline failed, there was never a requirement that pipelines need to be inspected. You could put a pipeline in the ground, it could sit there for 50 years, and you were never required to inspect that pipeline. One of the first things that happened after this pipeline failure and after we started pushing on Congress for regulations was they passed a rule that every 7 years or every 5 years, depending on the type of pipeline, they need to be inspected with internal computerized devices that can show what's going on with that pipeline. So that was a huge increase in pipeline safety across the whole country. There's pipeline failures almost every day somewhere in the country, but this is a big one that happened inside a town that killed 3 kids in a park, wiped out a whole salmon creek. And this community really came together to make sure that to try to make something good come out of such a tragedy. So we really took that bull by the horns and made sure that we didn't let this incident be forgotten, and really tried to push for more pipeline safety laws nationally. So it was a wake-up call, and Congress started having hearings, the federal regulators started moving forward on regulations, and to a large degree, I think the Bellingham incident was a sea change for pipeline safety regulations in the country.